My position is very clear. We gave away our weapons but got nothing in return, only a full-scale war and death. These words from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy capture a bitter truth. Ukraine once held the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. They had thousands of warheads, hundreds of missile launchers, enough to make the entire world take notice. Then in 1994, the Soviets took them back. Promises of protection followed, assurances from powerful allies. But nearly 3 decades later, these promises feel hollow. What did Ukraine get in return? They got a brutal invasion, occupied territories, and hundreds of thousands dead. Many can wonder, if Ukraine had kept those weapons, would we have seen the annexation of Crimea in 2014? Would Vladimir Putin have dared launch a full-scale war in 2022? In this video, we dive into the story of Ukraine's decision to give up the Soviet nuclear arsenal it inherited and ask the tough question, was it a fatal mistake? Let's start with Zelensky's unfiltered words. The quote about Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons and receiving nothing in return comes from an October 21st briefing with journalists and represents more than just frustration. Zelensky's candid words reveal a painful reality Ukraine is currently facing. When Ukraine handed over its nuclear arsenal, it hoped for protection, safeguards that would keep the country secure, allies that would stand by it. Instead, Zelenskyy says, Ukraine was left vulnerable to a full-scale invasion and vulnerable to Putin's aggression. That's why Zelenskyy hasn't shied away from being clear about this stance with global leaders. He's raised these very concerns with the US President Joe Biden and with the President-elect Donald Trump. He's asked, where's the justice for Ukraine? If NATO membership was always off the table, what other security umbrella was supposed to protect us? So far, no one has been able to answer that question. In Zelenskyy's eyes, because Ukraine surrendered its nukes, it should have gained NATO membership. That's all this war-torn country has ever wanted. It wasn't going to ask for those weapons back, just for the strength that NATO could provide, the strength that might finally deter Putin. And as Zelenskyy points out, that's the only way forward now. That's why the key point of Zelenskyy's victory plan, first introduced in September 2024, concerns just that, Ukraine's NATO membership. This is the first of 5 crucial elements of this plan presented to key players in the world of global geopolitics, from Biden to Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. This first point demands a NATO invitation for Ukraine even before the war ends, a move Zelenskyy calls a testament to determination to integrate Ukraine into the Western security framework. The other 4 points focus on one ultimate goal, strengthening Ukraine's resilience to outlast Russia's aggression and secure a lasting peace. Point 2 emphasizes ramping up Ukraine's defenses, allowing deeper strikes into Russian territory, using Western-supplied weapons, and coordinating with allies on air defenses. Point 3 aims to establish a strategic deterrence against Russia, with joint weapons production and the West financing the fortifications of Ukraine's military. Point 4 centers on leveraging Ukraine's rich resources like uranium and lithium to reinforce economic and security ties with the West. And finally, point 5 envisions a post-war role for Ukraine, with its battle-hardened troops contributing to NATO's defense across Europe. As important as each of these points is, it seems they all go back to one central objective: NATO membership. After all, a NATO member, not just a NATO partner, would have a much easier time defending its borders, strike back if threatened, and deterring future invasions with the full weight of the alliance behind it. So what does Zelenskyy envision with respect to Ukraine's NATO membership in his victory plan? As mentioned, his primary goal is to secure a formal invitation to join the alliance. This move is seen as crucial for ensuring Ukraine's long-term security and a vital step toward ending the war on terms favorable to the invaded country. Now you might wonder, why isn't the goal to secure a membership during the war, not just an invitation? It's simple really. Zelenskyy knows this isn't happening. The West is too cautious. The fear of escalating tensions with Russia weighs heavily on the minds of NATO leaders. They worry that granting full membership while Ukraine is in the midst of conflict could provoke a dangerous response from Moscow, a response that would almost inevitably include nuclear weapons. Of course, there's also the issue of Ukraine's occupied territories. NATO's membership criteria require a country to have stable borders and not to be engaged in ongoing territorial disputes at the time of entry into the alliance. With roughly 18% of Ukraine already constitutionally annexed by Russia and under its full control, granting full membership seems like an impossible mission. So until now, NATO has provided substantial support to Ukraine without extending a formal membership offer. Following the 2024 NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the alliance announced it would station a NATO attaché in Kyiv and pledged an impressive $43.5 billion in aid, underscoring its long-term commitment to Ukraine. Additionally, NATO had been conducting joint military training with Ukrainian forces and supporting demining operations in the Black Sea alongside Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. While this support has been a lifesaver for Ukraine, it still doesn't come close to NATO's Article 5. This clause obligates all NATO member states to defend any country that comes under attack. That's real security assurance, and that's why many experts speculate that Putin will seek to prolong the war to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, drawing parallels to 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia shortly after it received its invitation to the alliance. Georgia's membership remains pending due to the breakaway and declaration of independence of two Russian-backed republics, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and resistance to NATO membership by the current Georgian government. But back to Ukraine. Zelensky's victory plan also touches on a critical aspect of national defense: a comprehensive, non-nuclear deterrence package. Throughout the war, Russia has leveraged the threat of nuclear retaliation to intimidate not just Ukraine but also the West. And after Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in the 1990s, a decision heavily influenced by US diplomacy, it found itself at a stark disadvantage. Today, Russia holds the second largest nuclear stockpile in the world, with approximately 5,580 nuclear warheads. This huge number underscores the existential threat that Ukraine, and by extension the rest of NATO, faces. Recognizing this vulnerability, Zelensky's victory plan emphasizes the need for a non-nuclear deterrent. Thanks to some leaks, we now know that this deterrent primarily includes US-made Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles with an impressive 1,550-mile range. The goal is simple: limit Russia's military options and reduce its ability to project power without escalating to a nuclear confrontation. But Zelensky understands that while Ukraine may not have nuclear weapons, it can still deter aggression through strength, strategic alliances, and advanced military technology. But why doesn't Ukraine have nuclear weapons? It's time for a closer look at the historical context surrounding Ukraine's disarmament and the choices that led to its current predicament. Ukraine was a significant part of the Soviet Union from 1922 until its dissolution in 1991. At the time of the Soviet breakup, Ukraine was host to a large part of the vast Soviet nuclear arsenal, including various types of delivery systems. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Ukraine found itself in possession of approximately 1,700 nuclear warheads, making it the third largest nuclear power in the world. This number included 130 UR-100N intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, each capable of carrying 6 nuclear warheads, and 46 RT-23 Molodets ICBMs, with 10 warheads each, alongside 33 heavy bombers that could also deliver nuclear payloads. However, despite this formidable arsenal, Ukraine didn't actually have independent control over its nuclear weapons. The launch sequences and operational control were still firmly in the hands of Moscow, which legally owned them. So in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, Ukraine faced a complex decision regarding its nuclear inheritance. Although it was technically a nuclear power, the country initially agreed to denuclearize, in line with its commitments to Russia to either relinquish or destroy these weapons as a condition of securing independence peacefully. The Declaration of State Sovereignty, adopted in 1990, had already proclaimed Ukraine's intention not to accept, acquire, or produce nuclear weapons. Yet there was a significant degree of caution regarding the process of denuclearization. Why? Because leaders in Ukraine were aware that maintaining a nuclear deterrent could provide leverage in its relationship with Russia, which was not keen on losing its position as the dominant power in the region in the post-Soviet era. So ultimately, the international community played a crucial role in shaping Ukraine's nuclear destiny. The United States Under-Secretary of State James Baker advocated for Russia to inherit the Soviet Union's nuclear status while urging Ukraine to disarm. The rationale was that a nuclear-armed Ukraine could destabilize the post-Soviet landscape, with Baker famously suggesting that Ukraine could become a Yugoslavia with nukes. This perspective highlighted the fear at the time that a fragmented Soviet Union armed with nuclear weapons could lead to nothing but chaos. So in December 1991, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum, along with the US, the United Kingdom, and Russia. This document assured Ukraine of its sovereignty and territorial integrity in exchange for relinquishing its nuclear arsenal. Of course, it's now painfully clear that those assurances were little more than empty promises. But let's continue following Ukraine's path to denuclearization. In 1992, significant steps were taken to shape Ukraine's nuclear future. On May 23rd, Ukraine signed the Lisbon Protocol, which aimed to return nuclear weapons from Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan back to Russia. This protocol required all signatory states to join the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. However, within Ukraine, the appetite for denuclearization was waning. These pro-nuclear sentiments were only emboldened by the fact that the Lisbon Protocol allowed Ukraine up to 7 years to comply. So in June of 1992, US President George H.W. Bush wrote a letter to Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, lauding the Lisbon Protocol as a historical accomplishment. Bush outlined 4 assurances aimed at addressing Ukraine's security concerns: immediate action in the United Nations Security Council if Ukraine faced aggression, a commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, encouragement to participate in European security frameworks, and US assistance in strengthening Ukraine's conventional armed forces. Despite these assurances, Ukraine's leaders were not satisfied. They sought concrete commitments from both the US and Russia, emphasizing that reaffirmations of existing agreements were insufficient. This tension was compounded by deteriorating Ukrainian-Russian relations, fueled by disputes over the Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea declaring independence from Ukraine in May 1992. This decision was almost immediately retracted, resulting in Crimea becoming an autonomous republic within Ukraine, both in terms of the Ukrainian and Crimean constitutions. So by the end of 1992, Ukrainian parliamentarians had become increasingly vocal about retaining a nuclear deterrent. Many believed that Ukraine deserved at least temporary nuclear weapons status to secure its sovereignty. In an unexpected twist, the US promised $175 million in assistance for dismantling nuclear weapons, but Ukraine instead began asserting its administrative control over the warheads. In April 1993, Ukrainian frustration finally boiled over. 162 Ukrainian politicians signed a statement imposing 13 preconditions for ratifying START. These demands included security assurances from Russia, US foreign aid for dismantlement, and compensation for the handover of nuclear materials. On top of that, the politicians stated that Ukraine would only dismantle 36% of its delivery vehicles and 42% of its warheads, leaving the remainder under Ukrainian control. Naturally, this inflexible stance was met with disapproval from both Russia and the US, but at the time, Ukraine didn't care. By mid-1993, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or MFA, had drafted a proposal treaty with the 5 nuclear powers, known as the Nuclear 5 or P5, China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. This draft introduced a detailed mechanism for protecting Ukraine's security, aiming to trigger assistance and impose sanctions on any aggressor threatening Ukraine's territorial integrity. The MFA shared this proposal with US officials, including Ambassador Strobe Talbot and Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, during their visit to Kyiv in June. The Clinton administration, signaling greater awareness of Ukraine's security concerns, offered to help mediate nuclear talks with Russia. President Clinton would come to have a massive role in pressuring Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal, a role he would express regrets about in 2023. But let's go back to 1993. Even after the MFA's proposal, the US and other nuclear powers held back on any legally binding security guarantees, offering only political assurances instead. On September 3rd, Ukraine and Russia attempted another breakthrough by means of the Massandra Accords. Officials on both sides drafted agreements on the dismantling of the nuclear weapons in Ukraine and set up terms for compensation. But in the end, they couldn't finalize an agreement at the summit, leaving security issues unresolved. The result? Ukraine's strategic position was growing ever more complicated. Russia's perceived threat loomed larger, the West stood firm, and Ukraine continued to demand. However, Ukraine also faced mounting international criticism for delaying denuclearization. So when the Ukrainian parliament, known as the Verkhovna Rada, finally voted on the matter, the START 1 Lisbon Protocol did pass, but with multiple reservations. The Rada still insisted on keeping the portion of the nuclear arsenal not covered by the treaty and rejected Article 5, which would have required Ukraine to join the NPT as a non-nuclear state. Since ratification of this protocol was tied to the provision of security guarantees and financial compensation, Ukraine's path to denuclearization was left uncertain yet again. And then 1994 arrived. Early in the year, diplomatic pressure mounted on Ukraine. So on January 14th, the trilateral statement was signed, with Presidents Bill Clinton, Leonid Kravchuk, and Boris Yeltsin at the table. Ukraine agreed to fully disarm, dismantling its strategic weapons and transferring its nuclear warheads to Russia. In return, the US and Russia offered economic support and, finally, security assurances, albeit political ones rather than the legally binding guarantees Ukraine had pushed for. The deal also included US assistance in dismantling Ukraine's nuclear infrastructure and compensation for the commercial value of the highly enriched uranium. Another significant step followed suit. On February 3rd, the Rada ratified START 1, removing its earlier conditions. However, the NPT still wasn't fully endorsed, as the Rada wanted more solid commitments. That all changed by the year's end. On December 5th, the Budapest Memorandum was signed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe summit. Ukraine, the US, the UK, and Russia formalized a set of security assurances. These assurances pledged respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and borders. The agreement also emphasized non-interference and non-aggression and promised that the countries would consult if Ukraine's security was ever threatened. In response, Ukraine formally joined the NPT as a non-nuclear state on the very same day, marking the official end of its nuclear arsenal. That sealed it. Over 1,700 warheads and their corresponding delivery systems were either destroyed or returned to Russia. The Budapest Memorandum was undoubtedly a landmark in arms control. However, its promises would soon be tested. So now, as we're nearing the 30th anniversary of this monumental agreement, with Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and borders all under threat, we can't help but ask, would all this be happening if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons? However, to answer this question, we must address another one first. Could Ukraine have even retained the Soviet nuclear arsenal on its territory? In short, the answer is no. This has always been nothing but a pipe dream, a hollow hope wrapped in what-ifs. How so? A closer look at the technical, financial, and geopolitical obstacles involved will tell you all you need to know. As we've already mentioned, the nuclear arsenal that Ukraine inherited when the Soviet Union dissolved was truly massive, enough to make Ukraine, a 233,100 square mile country in Eastern Europe, the third largest nuclear power in the world. Yet appearances were deceptive. These weapons were never truly Ukraine's in any practical sense, so the idea of Ukraine maintaining and controlling these nuclear weapons was, in truth, a non-starter. Firstly, there were technical barriers to consider. The control over these nuclear weapons remained firmly in Moscow's hands. The warheads were safeguarded by electronic locks, known as permissive action links, which required codes held solely by the Russian command. Even if Ukrainian officials managed to bypass these locks, a risky and improbable scenario, they still lacked the infrastructure and expertise to maintain the warheads, let alone use them effectively. Now, this would be a huge issue as the Soviet warheads needed regular servicing due to the decay of tritium, a key component. Without a reliable replacement cycle, these warheads would degrade quickly, and Ukraine neither had the facilities for this upkeep nor the ability to produce new warheads when the old ones became unserviceable. And the latter fact was becoming more of a reality with each passing day. As former Soviet official Vitaly Katayev noted, the warheads Ukraine inherited were already approaching the end of their lifespan. Designed with a maximum service life of about 12 years, these warheads were 8 years old in 1991. In just a few years, without significant maintenance, many of these weapons would have become unusable. Of course, there's also the issue of finances. To put it plain and simple, operating a nuclear arsenal is expensive, and Ukraine, grappling with the economic fallout of independence, simply couldn't afford it. The cost of building the necessary facilities, training specialists, and maintaining infrastructure for nuclear upkeep was astronomical. We're talking billions of dollars. With Ukraine under immense financial strain just to manage the former Soviet military resources left on its soil, attempting to take on the burden of managing the nuclear arsenal as well would have outright ruined the country's economy. But let's say Ukraine somehow managed to scrape together the funds against all odds. Could it then have kept the nuclear weapons? Absolutely not. Retaining nuclear weapons would have placed Ukraine in direct opposition to the global nuclear non-proliferation framework, and this wouldn't have gone unnoticed or unpunished. The US and its allies would have imposed severe sanctions, crippling Ukraine's struggling economy even further. After all, the West, fully invested in global non-proliferation, made clear that it saw a nuclear-armed Ukraine as a destabilizing factor, so Ukraine's entire path to international legitimacy, vital financial aid, and future alliances depended on disarmament. Without it, Ukraine would have found itself increasingly isolated, cut off from critical economic lifelines. Russia, too, would have responded aggressively. Moscow saw a nuclear Ukraine as a direct threat, and still does. So had Ukraine signaled any intention to hold onto those warheads, Russia would have likely intervened long before 2014, when it annexed Crimea, following a referendum rejected by the West, which saw over 97% of Crimeans voting to join the Russian Federation. The presence of a powerful nuclear arsenal on its doorstep would have pushed Russia to preemptively disable the threat, potentially through direct military action. In other words, holding on to the nuclear arsenal would have actually made Ukraine a target sooner rather than later, attracting conflict rather than deterring it. This also partially answers the question that keeps arising: could a nuclear-armed Ukraine have deterred Russian aggression? Now, this is a fair question. After all, nuclear weapons, by their very nature, are powerful deterrents. They command respect and fear. They're one of the main reasons why Russia hasn't been punished more severely for its actions in Ukraine. So some still argue that Russia would have thought twice before annexing Crimea or intervening in eastern Ukraine had the country retained its arsenal. And in theory, the prospect of nuclear escalation would have acted as a powerful check on Russian actions. But in practice, this scenario is far from certain. Let's stick to our real-life timeline and suppose that Russia didn't attack Ukraine as soon as it rejected denuclearization. The reality is that Ukraine's nuclear weapons wouldn't have been in working condition by the time Russia's threats materialized. As mentioned, without maintenance and replacement of aging components, many of Ukraine's warheads would have been little more than relics by the early 2000s. But let's suppose Ukraine did manage to retain a small, functioning arsenal. Would that have been enough to ward off Russia? Perhaps. But Russia, a nuclear power itself, might have called Ukraine's bluff, assuming Kyiv wouldn't risk self-destruction over an invasion. Moreover, a nuclear-armed Ukraine might have triggered far more aggressive preemptive actions from Russia, which considers a hostile, nuclear neighbor as intolerable. As history has shown, nuclear deterrence is a high-stakes game that can invite as much aggression as it deters. Moscow might have launched targeted strikes on Ukraine's nuclear sites, perceiving them as direct threats, creating an even more destructive situation for the region. Nuclear weapons may deter some conflicts, but they can also escalate risks, and Russia's security concerns would likely have driven it to neutralize the threat before it escalated. Thus, while a hypothetical nuclear arsenal in Ukraine might have made some difference, it's uncertain whether it would have prevented Russian interference. Nuclear arms might have protected Ukraine's sovereignty in a best-case scenario, but they also could have hastened Russia's resolve to act, while it still had the upper hand. In the end, Ukraine faced a series of impossible choices, forced to abandon weapons it couldn't control or maintain, and to trust security assurances that would later prove tenuous. The point about security assurances is precisely the problem. Let's remind you that Ukraine never really wanted to keep the nuclear weapons for the sake of it, but for the power they possess. All the country wanted was security and stability in a post-Soviet landscape that was anything but predictable, or at least, so it says. This leads us to a deeper understanding of the Budapest Memorandum's failings. The flaw lay not in Ukraine's decision to disarm, but in the lack of enforceable security mechanisms to protect its sovereignty. The memorandum provided assurances, but these were merely diplomatic promises without the weight of binding defense obligations. The memorandum's failure underscores a broader lesson. Security guarantees without clear enforcement mechanisms can leave nations vulnerable to precisely the threats they sought to avoid. So in the end, Ukraine's denuclearization can't be dismissed as a strategic mistake on Ukraine's part. Ukraine's loss doesn't lie in giving up the nuclear weapons themselves. It ties in the unfulfilled promise of international security in return. Instead of serving as a powerful defender of the nation, the Budapest Memorandum serves as a reminder that real security can't rely on promises alone. A reminder President Zelenskyy perfectly encapsulated in a few words: "We gave our weapons, but got nothing in return." But what do you think? Is it too late for Ukraine to actually get meaningful security guarantees in return? Or has the devastation already rendered even NATO membership an empty promise? Also, if NATO membership remains elusive, do you believe Ukraine might pursue a nuclear deterrent itself, which Zelenskyy has hinted at as a possibility if NATO membership is not forthcoming? Share all your thoughts in the comments section below.